The small diner on the corner of Main Street was the kind of place where people went to escape the rush of the world. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, welcoming, and filled with the smell of fresh coffee and homemade pie. Frank, an elderly man with a kind face and a strong presence, was one of its regulars. He liked to sit at his favorite corner table, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. Frank was a retired veteran, though he rarely talked about his past. Most people in town respected him, not just for his service, but for his kindness and quiet strength. He always held the door open for others, tipped generously, and remembered everyone's name. On this particular day, Frank sat quietly, his old hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his mind wandering to memories of years gone by. The diner was busy but calm, the clatter of dishes and soft chatter filling the air. He enjoyed these moments of peace, far removed from the battles he had faced in his younger days. The calm was shattered when the door burst open with a loud bang. A group of young men stormed in, their loud voices cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. They were laughing and talking over each other, ignoring the disapproving looks from the other diners. Frank glanced up from his paper. The group, 5 in total, looked to be in their 20s. They were dressed casually, but their body language was anything but relaxed. They walked with a kind of arrogance, as if the world owed them something. Frank had seen their kind before. The strangers took the largest table in the center of the diner, loudly calling for the waitress. She hurried over with a polite smile, though it was clear she felt uneasy. The men began to place their orders, their voices booming as they laughed at jokes only they found funny. Frank returned to his paper, hoping they would settle down, but their noise only grew louder. Their laughter turned to mocking comments about the other diners, harmless enough at first, but it was clear they were testing boundaries. Frank noticed the waitress flinch as one of them spoke to her in a tone that was less than respectful. The other diners exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly, though he stayed seated. He was a patient man, but his years in the military had taught him to stay alert, especially when tensions began to rise. Then it happened. One of the men noticed Frank sitting alone. "Hey, look at the old man over there," he said loudly, pointing in Frank's direction. His friends laughed, and Frank felt their eyes on him. Frank stayed calm, not looking up from his paper. He had dealt with far worse situations in his life. Still, he could feel the energy in the room shift as the men continued to joke at his expense. The waitress glanced nervously at Frank, but he gave her a small, reassuring nod. He wasn't afraid, not in the slightest. But as the group's laughter grew louder, Frank knew one thing for sure. This peaceful day wasn't going to stay quiet for long. The laughter from the group echoed across the diner, growing louder with each passing moment. Frank could feel the weight of their stares, but he kept his gaze steady on the newspaper in front of him. He wasn't one to rise to provocation. His years in the military had taught him the value of patience and self-control. One of the young men, clearly the boldest of the group, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice sharp and mocking. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" His friends erupted in laughter, encouraging him to continue. Frank didn't flinch. He simply turned the page of his newspaper, as though the taunts were nothing more than the hum of the diner's ceiling fan. But the young man wasn't satisfied. He nudged one of his friends, motioning toward Frank. "Bet he's one of those grumpy old vets who thinks he's better than everyone else." Another chimed in. "Yeah, probably sits around telling war stories no one cares about." Their laughter grew louder, causing a few of the other diners to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The waitress, still carrying an armful of plates, glanced nervously at Frank. She knew he was well liked in the town and hated to see him being treated this way. Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, his calm demeanor unshaken. He wasn't one to lash out or engage in unnecessary confrontation. Yet the words of the young men stirred something deep within him. Not anger, but a quiet resolve. "Should we ask him to join us?" the bold one joked, standing up as though he were about to approach Frank. His friends egged him on, their voices filled with misplaced bravado. Just then, an older man sitting at a nearby table cleared his throat loudly. He wasn't as composed as Frank and had had enough of the group's behavior. "Why don't you boys quiet down and show some respect?" he said firmly. The leader of the group turned to him with a mocking grin. "Respect? For what? We're just having some fun." The older man's face reddened, but before he could respond, Frank calmly folded his newspaper and placed it on the table. All eyes in the diner turned to him as he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "Fun's one thing," Frank said, his voice steady but commanding, "but disrespecting others isn't something you'll want to make a habit of." The diner fell silent. There was something in Frank's tone, calm yet undeniably authoritative, that made even the young men pause. For the first time, they seemed to notice the way he carried himself, upright, confident, and unshaken. The leader of the group smirked, trying to regain control of the situation. "Oh, yeah. And what are you gonna do about it, old man?" Frank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked him directly in the eye, his calm gaze unnerving. "Sometimes," Frank said, "doing nothing is the loudest answer." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The young man shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. His friends were silent now, their earlier laughter forgotten. Frank sat back down, picking up his coffee again as though nothing had happened. The leader of the group glanced at his friends, unsure if he should back off or press further. The tension in the room was palpable, and everyone knew this encounter was far from over. The diner grew quieter after Frank's calm yet powerful words. The group of young men seemed uncertain, their earlier confidence shaken by the elderly veteran's unflinching demeanor. Frank, however, had already returned to his coffee, acting as though nothing had happened. The leader of the group, clearly unwilling to let things go, leaned forward on the edge of his chair. He tapped the table with his fingers, trying to regain the attention of his friends. "Come on, guys," he said with a forced laugh. "We're not going to let some old guy tell us what to do, right?" His friends mumbled in agreement, but their enthusiasm was half-hearted. Frank's calm reaction had thrown them off balance, and the mood wasn't as light as before. One of the young men, trying to lighten the tension, whispered, "Maybe we should just eat and leave. This guy looks serious." But the leader wasn't about to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. "Serious," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's he gonna do, hit us with his cane?" This time, there was no laughter. Even his friends looked uneasy. The older diners exchanged knowing glances, silently rooting for Frank. The waitress, standing behind the counter, nervously wrung her hands, unsure if she should step in or let the situation play out. Frank placed his cup down gently on the saucer, his movements deliberate and calm. He looked up at the leader, meeting his gaze with a level of intensity that made the young man's smirk falter. "You know," Frank began, his voice as steady as a drumbeat, "in my time, I've seen men act tough, just like you. They talk big, puff out their chests, but when it comes down to it, they crumble like dry leaves in the wind." The young man blinked, unsure whether Frank was insulting him or simply making an observation. Before he could respond, Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The real strength of a man isn't in his words or how loud he can be. It's in his actions and how he treats others. The leader tried to regain control, scoffing loudly. "Is that supposed to scare me? Because it doesn't." Frank chuckled softly, the sound unexpected and disarming. "Scare you? No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not here to scare anyone. I'm here to remind you that respect is earned, not demanded. And from what I've seen, you've got a lot of work to do in that department." The young man's face reddened, and his friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The other diners, sensing that Frank had gained the upper hand, began to relax, though their eyes remained glued to the unfolding scene. The leader of the group stood up, pushing his chair back noisily. "You think you're so wise, don't you?" he snapped. "Just because you're old doesn't mean you get to lecture me." Frank didn't rise this time. He simply looked up at the young man and smiled faintly. "You're right," he said. "Age doesn't give me the right to lecture you, but it does give me the experience to know when someone's heading down the wrong path. The choice is yours to make, son. Just be sure you can live with it." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their weight undeniable. The young man hesitated, his bravado faltering as he searched for a way to respond. His friends avoided his gaze, and for the first time, the leader seemed unsure of himself. The atmosphere in the diner shifted again. Everyone could feel that the tension wasn't over yet, but it was clear that Frank had planted a seed of doubt in the young man's mind. The leader of the group stood frozen for a moment, his jaw tightening as Frank's words sank in. Around him, his friends stayed silent, their earlier smirks now replaced with uncertain glances. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The young man finally broke the silence, leaning forward and slamming his hands on the table. "You think you're better than me, old man?" he asked, his voice louder now, but trembling slightly. "Sitting there all high and mighty like you've got it all figured out." Frank met his gaze calmly, showing no reaction to the outburst. He let the words hang in the air before speaking. "Better than you," he repeated slowly. "No, but I do know one thing. A man who respects others earns respect in return. A man who doesn't, well, he's usually left standing alone." The leader's face turned red, his friends now looking anywhere but at him. He opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by a soft voice from behind the counter. "Frank," the waitress called, her tone shaky but filled with concern. "Are you okay? Should I call someone?" Frank turned to her and gave a reassuring smile. "No need for that, Mary. Everything's just fine." The leader snorted. "Fine. You're sitting here lecturing me like some kind of saint. Why don't you just mind your own business?" Frank didn't miss a beat. "This is my business," he said firmly. "When someone walks into a place like this and thinks they can treat others poorly, it becomes everyone's business. This isn't about me or you. It's about what kind of man you want to be." The leader flinched slightly at the last sentence, his friends shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Frank leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering but carrying even more weight. "You think being loud makes you strong. It doesn't. It only makes you noticed. Real strength is knowing when to step back, when to listen, and when to admit you're wrong." The words seemed to hang in the air, touching something deep in everyone who heard them. A few of the other diners nodded silently, their respect for Frank growing by the second. The leader of the group stepped back from the table, crossing his arms. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, though his earlier confidence was nowhere to be seen. Frank gave a small nod. "You're right," he said, his tone softer now. "I don't. But I've known men like you, men who feel like they have to prove something, but don't know what that something is." The leader's eyes darted around the room, and for a brief moment, he looked almost vulnerable. His friends remained silent, clearly torn between siding with him and staying out of it. Frank leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Think about this moment," he said, his voice steady. "You have the chance to leave here with your head held high or to keep digging yourself into a hole. The choice is yours." The leader didn't reply. Instead, he stared at Frank, his expression unreadable. Around them, the diner remained silent, everyone waiting to see what the young man would do next. But whatever was coming, one thing was clear. Frank had already made his point. The leader of the group stood in place, his arms crossed tightly, trying to think of something to say. His pride was bruised, but the weight of Frank's calm words lingered in the air like a challenge he wasn't prepared to face. Around him, the other diners watched in silence, their unease shifting to quiet admiration for the elderly man. "Let's just go," one of his friends whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. The suggestion hung awkwardly between them, but the leader wasn't ready to back down yet. He took a step closer to Frank's table, his movements sharp but hesitant. "You think you're some kind of hero," he said, his voice quieter now, almost defensive. You don't scare me. Frank looked up from his coffee, his gaze steady and unreadable. I'm not trying to scare you, he said. I'm trying to help you. The leader blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected response. Help me, he scoffed, though the confidence in his voice was fading. I don't need your help. Frank gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. Maybe not now, he replied. But one day you might. And when that day comes, I hope you remember that the way you treat others will come back to you. The leader's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. His friends were looking at him now, their earlier amusement replaced with discomfort. None of them seemed to know what to say or do. The silence was broken by Mary, the waitress, who approached cautiously with a fresh pot of coffee. Can I refill that for you, Frank? She asked, her voice steady but kind. Frank smiled warmly and slid his cup toward her. Thank you, Mary. That would be great. The simple exchange seemed to underline the quiet strength Frank carried with him, a strength that didn't need loud words or aggressive actions to be felt. The young men shifted uncomfortably, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the moment. Finally, one of the quieter members of the group stood up, pushing his chair back. I think we should go, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. The leader turned to him, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but then he sighed heavily and stepped back. Fine, he muttered, throwing his hands up. Let's go. The group began to gather their things, their earlier laughter and confidence completely gone. As they moved toward the door, the leader glanced back at Frank, his expression unreadable. You think you've won or something, he said, his tone more subdued than before. Frank met his gaze with a calm smile. It's not about winning, he said simply. It's about doing what's right. The young man hesitated, then shook his head and walked out, his friends following silently behind him. As the door closed behind them, a wave of relief swept through the diner. The other diners began to murmur, some offering quiet words of praise for Frank. Mary placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, her smile warm and genuine. You handled that so well, Frank, she said softly. Thank you. Frank nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. Sometimes, he said, the best way to fight is with words, not fists. The tension in the diner melted away, replaced by a sense of calm and admiration for the quiet hero sitting at the corner table. As the door of the diner swung shut behind the group of young men, the air inside seemed lighter. Conversations resumed among the diners, though many still stole glances at Frank. He quietly sipped his coffee, as if the tension-filled exchange moments ago had never happened. Mary, the waitress, lingered by his table, her expression a mix of gratitude and admiration. You really have a way with words, Frank, she said softly. Most people wouldn't have handled that so calmly. Frank gave her a kind smile. Sometimes words are all you need, he replied. But it's not always easy to make people listen. Just then, the door swung open again. Everyone turned to see the group of young men returning, their faces tense. The leader strode in first, his steps deliberate, and the energy in the room shifted once more. Frank set his coffee down and looked up, his calm demeanor unshaken. Back so soon? He asked, his voice steady. The leader didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked up to Frank's table and pointed at him. You think you're so smart, don't you? He said, his tone challenging. Talking like you've got all the answers. Frank raised an eyebrow. No one has all the answers, he replied. But I do know enough to see when someone's looking for something they can't find. The young man bristled, clearly caught off guard by the statement. You don't know anything about me, he snapped. You think you're tough because you've got a story to tell. Let's see if you're really as tough as you act. There was a murmur of unease among the other diners. Mary looked worried, and a few customers began to shift in their seats. Frank didn't rise to the bait. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on the young man. "Strength isn't about proving something to others," he said calmly. "It's about knowing when to walk away and when to stand your ground." The leader smirked, but his bravado seemed forced. "Well, I'm standing my ground," he shot back. "What about you?" Frank studied him for a moment, then slowly stood up. He wasn't a large man, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made him seem taller, stronger. The room went completely silent as he looked the young man in the eye. "I stood my ground when it mattered," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "Not here, in a diner, but on battlefields where lives depended on it. I fought for people I didn't even know, because it was the right thing to do. That's strength." The young man's smirk faltered. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. Frank continued, his gaze unwavering. "If you want to prove you're strong," he said, "start by respecting yourself and others. That's the kind of strength that lasts." The leader didn't say anything. His friends, who had followed him back into the diner, looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting between Frank and their leader. After a long pause, the young man lowered his hand and stepped back. He didn't apologize, but the fight seemed to leave him. "Whatever," he muttered, turning to leave. This time, when the group walked out, the tension didn't return. Instead, there was a quiet understanding among the diners that they had just witnessed something important, a lesson taught not with fists, but with wisdom and dignity. Frank sat back down, his movements calm and deliberate. He picked up his coffee and took a sip, the faintest smile on his lips. For him, it was just another day of doing what was right. As the door swung shut behind the group of young men, the atmosphere in the diner changed once again. It was as if a weight had been lifted. The murmurs of the other diners slowly faded, and the soft clink of plates and cups resumed. Mary, the waitress, was the first to break the silence. "Thank you, Frank," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "You really did a good job of handling that." Frank gave a small smile, his eyes warm. "No need to thank me, Mary. Just doing what's right." The other diners, who had been watching the whole exchange, nodded in agreement. Some smiled, others offered quiet words of encouragement. They had witnessed something rare, someone standing up for what was right without ever raising a hand. It had left a lasting impression on them. A few moments passed, and the noise in the diner returned to normal. But it wasn't the same as before. The sense of unease had disappeared, replaced by a feeling of calm. The group of young men, who had been so full of arrogance just a short while ago, were now gone. As Frank sat back in his chair, sipping his coffee, he noticed the younger crowd in the diner watching him. Their eyes were filled with respect and curiosity. He had become a quiet hero in their eyes, someone who had proven that strength wasn't always measured in physical power, but in character and courage. Frank, however, didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a man who had lived a long life, one full of experiences and lessons. He'd seen things that most people could never imagine, and those experiences had shaped him into the man he was today. But for him, it wasn't about glory. It was about doing what needed to be done, and standing firm when it counted. The door to the diner opened again, and Frank looked up to see the group of young men standing on the sidewalk outside. They were looking inside through the window, their faces hard to read. Frank didn't flinch. He had already made his point. The leader of the group looked over at Frank, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. The young man didn't speak. He didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Frank had won the battle, but not with words alone. He had done it by standing up for what was right and showing the young man a different way. Finally, the group turned and walked away, disappearing into the street. The sound of their footsteps faded as they left, and the diner returned to its usual calm. Frank leaned back in his chair and sighed, his mind at ease. It had been a simple moment, but one that would stay with him for a long time. He wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't need applause or praise. All he wanted was to know that, for once, he had made a difference. As he finished his coffee, he glanced around the diner, meeting the eyes of the other patrons. They smiled at him, their respect for him growing with each passing moment. Frank nodded quietly, then stood up to leave. "Take care, Frank," Mary called after him, her voice warm and full of gratitude. Frank smiled and nodded. "You too, Mary. You too." And with that, he walked out of the diner, his back straight, his head held high. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. As Frank walked out of the diner, the last of the tension seemed to evaporate. The soft sounds of the town returned, as if the brief storm of aggression had passed. Inside, the other diners who had witnessed the exchange were still reflecting on what had happened. They were left in awe of the quiet strength Frank had displayed. Mary, the waitress, had gone back to the counter, but her eyes followed Frank as he left. She smiled softly to herself, feeling proud of her longtime customer, but also deeply moved by the way he had handled the situation. "That man's got a heart of gold," she whispered to herself. The older man who had spoken up earlier, the one who had defended Frank, leaned back in his chair with a nod of approval. He was a regular, someone who had seen many things in his time, but what he had witnessed today was different. It wasn't often that someone stood up so calmly and confidently for what was right without seeking anything in return. "I don't know about you," the older man said to the person sitting across from him, "but I'll be telling my grandkids about this. Frank's got more guts than most of us." A young woman sitting nearby overheard the conversation and nodded. "I saw that too," she said thoughtfully. "He didn't even raise his voice. He just knew exactly what to say. That was powerful." There was a buzz in the room now, a quiet hum of respect. Word about what had happened began to spread among the regulars. Frank had become something of a legend, not because he had won a physical confrontation, but because he had shown them all how to deal with conflict in a way that didn't involve violence or anger. One by one, the diners began to approach Mary at the counter, offering their own comments. "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that," a man said, shaking his head. He didn't back down, but he didn't raise his fists either, just stood his ground with words. Mary smiled at each of them, grateful that the diner had become a place of respect rather than tension. "Yeah, Frank's been through a lot. I guess he knows what really matters in life." As the afternoon wore on, the normal flow of business returned, but the earlier events had left an imprint on everyone in the diner. Frank's brief encounter with the young men had shown them all that true strength was not about physical power or loud words. It was about knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to stay calm in the face of challenge. Even the young man who had initially challenged Frank was still on everyone's mind. Several patrons had seen him walking down the street later, his head hung low, his body language different. It was clear that the experience had affected him more deeply than he had let on. Frank's words had planted a seed in his mind that he couldn't easily shake. The diner, once again full of chatter and clinking cups, had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions can leave the biggest impact. And as for Frank, he had already moved on with his day, having quietly returned to the calm of his life. He didn't seek attention, but in that moment, he had become the person everyone would remember. Not for what he had said, but for what he had done. The next day, the diner was as busy as usual. The morning crowd came in for their coffee and breakfast, the familiar hum of conversation filling the space. But something had changed. There was a quiet buzz in the air, a sense of respect that hadn't been there before. Frank was a regular, of course, but today, when he walked in, heads turned, not out of surprise, but out of respect. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention, but his actions from the day before had made him a hero in the eyes of the people who had witnessed them. He made his way to his usual seat in the corner, nodding politely at the patrons as he passed. Mary, the waitress, smiled at him as he settled down. "Morning, Frank," she said, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "Morning, Mary," Frank replied, his voice calm and steady. The conversation in the diner softened as the people around him turned their attention back to their meals, but every now and then someone would glance at him, a look of admiration in their eyes. Frank didn't mind. He wasn't someone who needed constant attention. But there was no denying the shift that had taken place. He had shown the people around him that true strength didn't always come from physical power or loud words. Sometimes it came from quiet confidence and knowing when to stand up for what was right. As Frank sipped his coffee, a young man who had been sitting at a nearby table approached him. He looked nervous, unsure of what to say. Frank glanced up, meeting his eyes. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said, his voice a little shaky. "I just wanted to thank you. I was one of the guys who was sitting with those guys yesterday." Frank raised an eyebrow, recognizing him immediately. The young man had been one of the ones who had mocked him and tried to start trouble. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I acted," the young man continued, his face reddening. "After everything you said, I realized I was just trying to act tough for no reason. You were right, and I was wrong." Frank nodded, giving him a small smile. "We all make mistakes, son," he said kindly. "What matters is that you recognize it and learn from it." The young man stood there for a moment, clearly uncertain of what to do next. Finally, he gave a short bow of his head. "Thank you," he said quietly before turning and walking back to his seat. Frank watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. He didn't need an apology to feel that he had done the right thing. But it was nice to see that his words had made an impact. As the day went on, the diner returned to its usual rhythm. But Frank's brief moment of action had left its mark. People were more mindful, more respectful, and more aware of the power of calm, thoughtful action. Frank didn't look for praise or attention. But in the hearts of the people who had witnessed what had happened, he had earned something far more valuable than applause. He had earned their respect. And for Frank, that was enough.